This episode is brought to you in part by MixFlip, the ultimate portfolio player for mixing and mastering engineers. Learn more at mixflip.io and use the promo code MYM to save $5 off your first paid month. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Carlos Mas, and if you're not familiar with Carlos, Carlos is a Grammy-nominated engineer. He's won Juno Awards, and many of the songs that he's worked on have charted on the Billboard charts. He's worked with artists such as Roger Waters, Mötley Crüe, YUNGBLUD, Machine Gun Kelly, and a whole bunch more. And in today's conversation, we have a great chat all about his entire workflow, and we get into the topic of top-down mixing, which is the way that he likes to work. And so we break down his process for how to approach top-down mixing, what he uses on his master bus, and how he approaches various tools like compression, saturation, EQ, and a whole bunch more. So if you're an engineer who's looking to find a faster approach to your mixes, top-down mixing is often a favorite approach because it allows you to make big moves to your entire mix with one plugin instead of having to go to every single one of your channels. So for example, let's say you wanted to add more top end and you felt like your mix was lacking in top end. Rather than adding top end to every single channel, you could just do that on your master bus. So that's just one example of how you can approach top-down mixing. But in this episode, Carlos definitely breaks down his entire process and all of the tools that he uses along the way. Also in this episode, we talk a lot about Carlos's journey into music production. And what you're going to hear is a story of determination. It's a story that has a lot of starts and stops and things that, quite frankly, would burn out a lot of other engineers. But it's great to hear Carlos tell his story and the adversity that he had through it and his determination, and to hear that, you know, even though your career can sometimes throw a lot of curveballs at you, you just have to keep your eye on the prize, and you can get where you want to be when you keep focused and you're willing to take on opportunities. And I think it's a really encouraging story here. So I think you're going to really enjoy that part of this episode as well. And then last but not least, in this episode, we also dive into his experience getting to work with Mötley Crüe and Bob Rock at Strong Room Studios in London. And it's definitely cool to hear some of the behind the scenes about how that went down and some of the lessons that he learned throughout the process. So yeah, there's a lot of really fun stuff to take from this episode. I can't wait for you to dive into it. So let's check it out. Carlos Mas, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going today, man?
Yeah, great. Thank you for inviting me to the podcast. Excited to chat today.
Of course, and you were recommended by Drew Bang, which is awesome. He's a great dude, and I love having him here. And always good to have people recommend other guests on the show too. So really excited to dive into today, man. For people who might not be familiar with you and who you are, what you do, and ultimately how you got into music and music production, can you give us that background?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I started playing guitar when I was like 9 years old. And I got into bands, you know, the classic thing, you know, the typical thing, playing with bands in high school and all of that. Yeah, I had a band. We were played in the radio and stuff back in Venezuela. I was born and raised in Venezuela. Yeah, I always loved music. I was always into that. I studied a bit of music. And at some point I decided to go and do a summer course at Berklee in Boston. It was a jazz guitar course, so very technical and stuff. So when I was there, I figured out that a lot of people didn't have like great tone on their instruments. And it was like, well, yeah, you play a lot, but it doesn't sound great. So I got a niche there, you know, and I already started programming sequences and stuff on the computer and things like that. And also I was very into like technology. I'm still very into technology. But the thing is, like, I started messing up with effects, and I had a full rack. You know, I had a Mesa Boogie Tri-Axis preamp with a TC Electronics G Major FX processor and a power amp, and I had the MIDI controller, so programming all the MIDI patches and changes with all of that. So it was like very, very interested in like tweaking knobs and pushing things around. And when I was at Berklee doing this short course, I figured out that the people didn't have great tone and all these things, and I was like, maybe I like the idea of, you know, working on the other side of the glass rather than being, you know, like, I thought that I didn't want my career to be to become a session musician or only play with bands and that type of stuff. So I started getting more into the production side of things, and as I said, like programming and all this stuff. So I started learning by myself, DIY, everything. And at some point, Like I was with my band and we needed to record some songs, you know, to be able to play in gigs and stuff. So I went to this studio, a good friend of mine now, Claudio Ramirez, back in Venezuela. And we started recording some stuff there. Also, it was my last year of high school, so I had to do an internship in something that had to do with something that I wanted to do in life. Like if you were a doctor, do an internship in a hospital or something like that. I decided to go to a recording studio, to Claudio's studio. It was downhill from there. You know, it was.
I like how you said downhill.
Yeah. It was love at first sight, you know, like microphones, preamps, compressors, and all this stuff that I had to learn super quickly. And it was just an internship. I wasn't doing much stuff, but I was able to watch how he worked. And then I decided to study something in uni that it wasn't related to music. It was something like broadcasting or whatever, something like that. It has a different name in Venezuela. You can go to journalism or broadcasting and that type of stuff. And it took me 3 months to figure out that wasn't what I wanted in life. So I changed to uni that had music production and sound engineering and started studying there. But by the first couple of months, I got a job in a studio with producer Ricardo Martinez in Venezuela. And I was learning in one day in the studio. I was learning, I don't know what I would learn in a semester at uni. So it was very, very fast. Like the first day he sat me on the computer, it's like, you're gonna do Pro Tools up, and I've never used Pro Tools before. I was using Logic at the time, so it was like very quick change of mindset and working in sessions. And it was just the two of us in the studio working with bands. And at that time, I would say like 60% of the alternative bands that were in the radio passed through the studio. So it was like amazing. It was an amazing opportunity to learn doing what I wanted to do. So I started there, worked for a couple years with him, working on lots of albums and stuff. Funny story, there was a client in the studio that he called to the studio and wanted to finish his record. And the thing is, like, he was kicked out of 2 other studios before that. So like very difficult person to work with. And the owner of the studio said like, hey, do you want to do this record at night? Like work on this. You get the chance to experiment and work with, like learn all the preamps, all the compressors, everything that we have, all the microphones, amps and everything. It was basically doing guitars, basses, a little bit of drums and vocals and everything extra like keyboards and all of that. But like most of the drums were recorded already. Most of the bass tracks were recorded already. So I started doing that at night, like from 7 till 4 a.m., things like that every day. And I think it was almost a year working nights. And I will arrive to the studio earlier, to do other sessions with this producer, just to, keep learning and doing stuff and all of that. So it was like cutting my teeth in the job with a very difficult client. It was not a great album. But I get the chance to learn a lot doing it and all that. It ended up sounding pretty cool, but like the songs were not great, and it was a very difficult project to work with. And then after a while, I decided to move to Argentina for a couple of years. I went there to work for Tweety Gonzalez. He's like a legendary rock or alternative producer in Latin America. He's worked with like huge artists in Latin America. People most probably don't know it in Europe or North America, but really, really big clients. So I went to work for him, even though that I was already engineering stuff and all that. I went back to start as a runner, basically. Start from scratch, but this time it was like a world-class studio, not a project studio. Now, his room was more like a producer's room, but the A room in the studio had an SSL, a 40-channel SSL 4000 G+. So it was also, having to face that for the first time. So I worked 2 years for him. It was supposed to be like 2 days a week, but I never left. So I started going every day to the studio to work. I didn't get paid a cent in 6 months or so. So I was basically eating all my savings and trying to do as much as I could to learn. And that turned very quickly into assisting And you know how it is. It starts first with like coiling cables and setting up mics. And that evolved until I will sit for a while in the computer while tracking, learn every move that he was doing, everything, all his tricks or whatever thing that he was doing to get the sounds that he liked and all of that. And basically learning to work the way he wanted to. And that evolved into a point where I was prepping mixes and sometimes starting mixes for him. I remember one time he called me and was like, I'm going to be a little bit late. Can you start the mix? And I had the client in the room. And I was like, okay, cool. Yeah, I'll start the mix. And I started doing everything that he did and all that. And he arrived like 3 hours late. So basically at that point, the mix was pretty close to be done. So he arrived and he said, I'm the finalizer, and sat on the table and like on the desk and just did a couple of tweaks here and there, some automation, and just, bosh, the mix was done. So yeah, it was pretty cool. He let me produce or co-produce some stuff with him. Like there was some songs, some albums. It was a very different from working for him than working for the actual studio, which it was more of a classical, very 80s minded type of studio where like you have to be a fly on the wall. You don't make observations or any comments to anything. And I was used to working with producers that we had always an open conversation about what we were doing and all that. So I did do a couple sessions for the studio, for the actual studio. It wasn't very amazing because of that. I was like in a different mindset, and I had to get used to that. But yeah, it evolved to a point where I was doing a lot of work, co-producing a couple tracks for different artists, which was fun. And then I got to a point that I felt that I wasn't going to keep growing because he had his own engineer that worked for him all the time and all of that. And I decided like, well, I think it's time to move on and try to do something different. So I went to the States, to Atlanta, Georgia, and my aunt lives there. So I was staying with my aunt to try to figure out if I could get a job there in a studio. It was super, super, super tough. I think I wrote to all of the studios in Atlanta, and only a couple of them replied. One was a mastering studio, which I wasn't like keen on working in mastering at the moment. And then a studio called SAC Recording, the owner of the studio, Jim Z. Supano, replied like, hey, we don't have any positions at the moment, but if you want to pop in and take a look around, you're welcome to do it. And I didn't have a car, and transport in Atlanta is not great. You have a subway that is basically 2 lines like that, and everything else is buses and very complicated. And I was used to walking a lot in Argentina, so I said like, well, I'm going to walk. It's just like 4 miles. I got lost in a park, and I arrived like an hour late to the time that I had to arrive to the studio. And he was really, really upset. He's like, wow, you're blowing this up and all that. And so like, hey, no, I came here walking. It was like 4 miles, and I got lost in this park. And he was like, are you okay? And offered me some tea and stuff. It's like, oh, it's fine. Let's do a tour of the studio. And it was great. So at the end of the tour, he said, like, I don't have any positions, but if you want to come here as a runner, after, again, being an engineer and stuff, it's like, sure, I'll do it. Of course I'll do it. And I started running and doing all the classic stuff, checking every room, changing light bulbs, doing all the stuff that no one wants to do, washing dishes. We have a dishwasher, so it was basically just putting the dishes in and taking them out. But everything else, like all the classic running stuff. But they will give me the rooms had codes to get in. So they will give me the code of the first room. It was more like a production room, a very small room. And it's like, well, if you don't have anything else to do on your runner time, if you've done all your duties and everything, you can just play in the room. It's like, yeah, sure. So I started learning the room, started working with that, figuring out, trying to mix some stuff there, recording some stuff and all that, until they allowed me to get into the SSL room. So they had a gigantic SSL 80-channel console. So yeah, it was pretty cool. And I get to assist in a few sessions. I did engineer a couple sessions, last-minute sessions. I was in the studio at the right time, and there was no one else available. It's like, can you do the session? It's like, yeah, sure. I had another job at night, so my shift in the studio was from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., but that session ran longer, so I had to arrive late to my other job, was cleaning offices at night. So I did that, and it was great experience. I had the chance to assist Jim, who was already retired from engineering. He worked with Aretha Franklin and Whitney Houston, so he's pretty cool guy. So we work on tape. I've never worked technically on tape with tape before by that time, and he sat me next to the tape machine to do tape upping and splicing and stuff. So it was really cool. And then my visa, the time that I could stay there, it was done. So I had to go back to Venezuela for a bit and see if I could come back. I went to Venezuela. Because of a political situation in Venezuela, I got stuck there for 2 years. I was renewing my passport, and the luggage with the passport got stolen or lost or something like that. So it took me 2 years to renew my passport. In that time, I worked in advertisement, music for advertisement and movies. So it was basically producing, arranging, and doing everything for TV ads and stuff like that, or series and things of that sort. That is very interesting because everything in that realm, in that world, is for the day before. So they give you the brief, and it has to be ready by the time that you have the brief. So it's time sensitive and very fast paced. So I had to learn to do all of that. And again, I was working from 10 till 6 or something like that. And at nights I was recording bands or producing bands in my own time, or doing sessions in the studio that I used to work in Venezuela. And at some point, the owner of the company, which is Alan, a good friend of mine, he's a singer of the band that I used to play with. It's called Famasloop, and we work in the studio together as well. He told me like, "Hey, man, you're miserable doing advertisement. You really love working with bands and working in the studio, like really studio time, recording everything with bands and collaborating and all that. You're fired." But in a very nice way. So it was like, just go to the studio and work the things that you want to do. I know this job is not making you that happy. So yeah, I stopped doing that and went back to work that studio full time. And in that time, I got the first Latin Grammy nomination with Famasloop, with that band, with something that we recorded a couple years before. So before I went to Argentina, we recorded this track, and that track got nominated to the Grammys because it was released in 2015. So I got the first one. I was like, oh yeah, amazing. And the next year, I had the second nomination with another Venezuelan artist to the Latin Grammys. So at the time, you're like 25, 26. You're like, yeah, everything that I do is this standard, and it goes that well. It's like, no, that you have to do a reality check and understand that that's a precious moment, and that's you're in a wave. That's the high part of the wave, and that doesn't happen all the time. So it was a good reality check, but I kept working. And then again, the political situation was very complicated. Sometimes I wasn't able to get to the studio because there were protests, and it was very difficult. I remember one time I was in my motorcycle going to the studio, and I see the protest and all the people like and all that, and suddenly I start seeing tear gas flying. They have special guns to shoot it, and it was like, and I see all the people running towards me, so I had to turn around and go as fast as I could to escape from that with the military coming. And went home and had to go straight to the bathroom and fill the sink with water and put my face to it because I was like crying because of the tear gas. And I was like, oh, this is too much. I need to move. And that's when I decided to come to London. Then again, I had to start from scratch. I didn't know anybody here, basically a couple people, but couldn't get a job in studios or anything. I started teaching in a small uni, this program of music production and engineering. So I started teaching for a while and mixing. And at some point, I got a client. I was working from home and stuff. I got a client to produce a record, or I produced a song, sorry, just one song. We needed a studio. I knew the people from Strong Room. I was friends with them. I said, like, well, I'm going to get a good deal here. Let's do tracking there, and then we'll mix it there as well. So I did that, and that helped me build up my relationship here. At some point with the same artist, this was pre-lockdown. So with the same artist in 2020, I had to get a room to work with her. We were doing an EP. We were going to do 5 songs, and we didn't have the budget to do a month in the studio, like a full rate and everything. So we decided to rent in this same building a small production room and work from there, have all my equipment and being able to use some of the strong room equipment as well. So we work on that, and Jake, the studio manager, now studio director, called me one evening and said like, hey, can you come to the studio? We have a last minute session. We don't have anyone to do it. I was like, sure, coming over. And I've worked only a couple times in the studio, so I didn't know these rooms well. So he basically gave me the keys of the studio and said like, off you go. And yeah, it's always been, I think, it's always been like that in my career. It's always been like, just don't think. Just try to do it.
I was going to say, there seems to be like a bit of a theme going on here where it's like, you have this willingness to just put yourself in places, even if you're not prepared or you don't feel super comfortable. It's like, you're going to go in there and you're going to see that as an opportunity to learn and to network and to strengthen your skills. Obviously it's taken you some time to get there, but it's all aligned, and it's helped you get to the point where you're at now with your career, where now you're working at a really cool space.
Yeah. So I was coming here every day. I think we worked on that EP for like 4 months. We were like working on the writing and everything. So it was a luxury in a way, working for so long on 5 songs. So sometimes we did 3 versions of the same song to figure out what was the right one and things like that. And I started having more of those last minute calls for sessions, and at some point I received an email with a welcome pack from Strong Room. It's like, welcome to Strong Room. So there was an opening. Someone from the team left and went completely freelancing, and there was an opening for a senior engineer to be in the studio. So that's what I got. I got that opportunity, and because I did a baptism of fire a few times. They were like, yeah, just do it. So I got the job and started working here and doing sessions for the studio. There was a time they would call me the Count or the Vampire, because I would take all the night sessions. Everything that was late and no one wanted to do, I will take it. And I work like that. I worked like that for a pretty long time.
Hey, real quick, just want to take a second to tell you all about our awesome podcast sponsor, MixFlip. In 2025, a great sounding portfolio is not enough. Instead, you need to be able to show the transformation that you bring. That is where MixFlip comes in. With MixFlip's interactive before and after player, potential clients can flip between the rough mix and your final master in real time, hearing the differences instantly. Plus, MixFlip offers traditional lossless audio players and mobile optimized landing pages that are perfect for your social bio. Want to book more clients? Start your 30-day free trial at mixflip.io and use the code MYM to save $5 on your first paid month. That's amazing. I mean, there's clearly like a hunger there for you, where like you knew what you wanted to do, and if it took a long time, you were willing to take that time. The fact that you even would go from being an engineer to a runner, and then like working your way back up, and then going back down again, like a lot of people just get so burnt out by that. But like clearly you were focused on the end goal, and however that journey looked, it didn't matter to you. You were willing to put yourself in there and have the extra jobs and whatnot to push yourself. So there's something to be said there for like that determination that was inside of you and forcing you to just keep moving forward with it.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not afraid of doing that, and I've done it many times, and I don't think I have to do it again. I hope I won't, but
yeah. Well,
yeah.
I'm curious to know, like over the span of your career, like you've definitely moved around between a lot of different countries and worked in lots of different studios on different music and different, advertising music and all sorts of stuff. I'm curious to know, like, how do you feel like your experience working in different countries and in different styles of music and all that stuff? How do you feel like it's influenced the work that you do these days?
Well, I do a lot of... When some American artists come to London to work at Strong Room, I tend to do a lot of that because I can nail the American sound a bit. But probably I sound too British for Americans and too American for British people. So I sit somewhere in the middle that it's in between that, and it's fine. I think that's the influence that I have, that I kind of blend between both worlds. I like really punchy, aggressive sounding, big sounding stuff, but I'm not shy with effects. So that's like the combination of both worlds in a way.
Yeah. Well, that kind of ties into something that I was thinking when I was listening to your portfolio and the music on your website. Like, one thing that stood out to me is that your mixes, they don't sound like a lot of modern, like super hyped, overly top end, like super edited, all that kind of stuff. Like, instead, your music tends to have like a lot more character to it. And I feel like it focuses a lot more on the vibe. And I think that that's what like ultimately makes your track sound unique in a very pleasing way. And I feel like it highlights the character of the artist a little bit more, as opposed to just being like a very cookie cutter, here's the big rock sound kind of thing. And so it's cool to hear, like, I feel like I can hear some of your Latin influence and all that kind of stuff coming into it, and just, you know, seeing how you fuse all those different styles to it.
Yeah, I'm always been fascinated by distortion and saturation and stuff like that, and I think on probably the mixes you've listened to, it sounds quite saturated and quite colorful and stuff. Like, I always go for vibe rather than anything else, but always very punchy and kind of aggressive in a way, but subtle when it has to be subtle. So yeah.
So then, in terms of like establishing the sound of a record before you even start producing it or recording or mixing it, like, how do you typically go about establishing that and like having those conversations with an artist, maybe of like, you know, where this project's going to go, and, you know, determining what that end goal is going to look like?
Well, ultimately it's their vision, right? But if they call me for a reason, and they want me to steer the boat or to help them reinforce what the idea they already have. But I'm very visual about music. Like, I don't have synesthesia, but I hear things in textures. So to me, music is like photography, is like textures. So I can hear the grain of things, or if it's more black and white, or the palette. So I can work with that, like try to figure out a palette and some influences. I don't like referencing things. I think the referencing things is because you're comparing with something that doesn't have anything to do. But maybe you listen to something, it's like, oh, I like the vibe of it. So understanding what's the vibe of something, and like, well, if you want to do something like this artist, is like, well, work with the people that did that record, not with me, or I don't know, make some other music, because it's not gonna sound like that. But I always hear like what could be. Like, I've always had this since I was young, like very young. Like I could hear the finished product without with only the demo or only a rough version of it. I could hear the rhythm and all the instrumentation that could pop in and stuff. So it's a little bit of that, and a little bit of working in the moment with the artists, and like some ideas pop in and develop. But I always tend to go for kind of darker references, if in a way, or darker sounds. Not darker as not as dull or without top end, but darker, more like less naive, I think, in terms of production or mixing. So always looking for something like, oh, well, what if we distort this? What if we change this pattern here? What if we add something there? And always like trying to make things dynamic. Not dynamic in dynamic range, but dynamic in the way it flows. So I work that way, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny because like one area where I guess you and I differ in our approach is that I love reference tracks, and you know, but my argument for reference tracks is really more just as like, I think a lot of artists come into a project with their vision in mind, and it's often based on music that they're familiar with, right? So they tend to say like, they're at the end of the day, I guess they're going to compare your music, like the music that they make with you, to some other song or whatever, right? So in that sense, I do think that reference tracks can be helpful, and but I see your point too, that like, you know, if you're just leaning into something that is irrelevant to the project, then it's going to steer you in a completely different direction as well. So you do have to be very mindful of how you're going to use references if you do.
Yeah, you can. Like, for instance, if I'm mixing something, I don't want a reference to sound like that mix, but maybe you're not sure about the low end of something, and you want to listen to a track that you feel that has something to do, and you're like, oh, maybe, or something that you know very well, depending on the, maybe it's in a room that you haven't worked before or something, and you want to listen to understand what you're listening to, but not like, oh, I want to copy this or I want to try to make it like that, because I'm not that person. So I'm not that engineer. So if you want that sound, work with that engineer who did that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I prefer to try to find our own soul or our own sound to things, like who are we? So it's more existential, I think. I'm going to get more philosophical, but it's more existential about like who are we and or who is this? What is this project? And when I come into production, like if I'm producing, I'm like another member of the band. Like I always try to say that, like I have a vote. I'm not a dictator, but like I prefer to have a collaborative thing that we can bounce ideas. And sometimes to get here, you have to go there, because maybe the artist doesn't know that we have to go there. But let's go there, and that will take us to a different place and play with that type of stuff. So I always think that experimentation is what leads to great stuff, because maybe you discover something by accident, or you discover something by doing what you shouldn't be doing, or doing something different. Maybe, Brian Eno has that approach, in some things. He had these cards that tell you to do different things. While when you are stuck with something, you maybe read a card and the card says, do the opposite. It's like, oh yeah, maybe I should do the opposite. Let's see what happens. And I think that experimentation, it's fantastic.
I love that. I think that's like, I think that's very true. And yeah, I know before we started recording, we were talking about how you were listening to the Michael Beinhorn episode that I did. And like, he talked a lot about that as well, like finding the unique character of an artist and forcing them into, or like maybe not forcing them, but like steering them in a direction where they can experiment and ultimately find something that brings out who they truly are and what makes them unique. And it ends up making your record sound really interesting and more special and more authentic, I guess, when you find that, like that thing that is different, and it does separate them from like every other artist that has a similar sound,
Yeah, I think it also depends which type of artist and what's the role that you have in that project, right? So I find that different tiers of artists, and this is gonna sound weird, but like if it's a new artist, there is room for certain things, and you can experiment more, and you can help them to mold stuff because they're new. Maybe they have a right idea to do something. Maybe the approach is wrong, or maybe they're not sure. They don't have a sound yet, and you're helping to develop a sound for them, right? But tend to be sometimes a little bit arrogant when they're new, because they when you're young, you think that you know everything, or it's like, oh, this is what I want, whatever. So it takes a little bit of different psychology to work with that. Then you have a medium-size artists that they tend to think that they are big-size artists, and that's more difficult. I think that those are the difficult ones to work with. The new ones, you can get away. They might be a little bit cocky sometimes, but you just remember they're young and they're learning as well, and we all are learning. So, but the medium size, I always have the worst experiences, I think, with medium size artists, like the biggest egos and the more difficulty doing things and maybe not respecting your craft. I think what we do has shifted so much in the past years, recent years. The budgets are not the same. The time that you have in the studio is not the same. Music's not done the same way. So everything has changed drastically. So it's very, very different from what it used to be. Because now you have to be that kind of a jack of all trades. You have to be able to produce and engineer and mix and do all these things. That you have artists that they track themselves. They do a lot of stuff themselves. And then they come to a big studio and you're the engineer, but they don't respect you because they think you're like, I've been called a knob tweaker and things like that. And it's just like, well, yeah, I tweak knobs, but come on, like just a little bit of respect, and things like that. I've had artists that don't even look at you when they come to the studio. They don't talk to you if they don't have to, and things like that. It's a little bit awful to do stuff that way. And then when I've worked with like super, super big artists, it's amazing. They're super down to earth. Most of like all of the ones that I've worked with, they're nice people. They respect you. They know that you are in the room because you deserve to be in the room. You're there for a reason. So they listen to you, and and it's a really, really good experience. But you're not gonna grab, you're not gonna, I don't know, tell a huge artist to like, hey, this is, I think the vision of this is not the right one. Or when I'm working with a big producer, like tell him like, I don't think we should do it now. It's like you have your your role in the studio. So if I'm engineering, I have that role, and yeah, I can give my opinion about a take and stuff, but I'm not gonna change the arrangement of something. If I'm producing, that's a different game. I will flip the song upside down if I have to. So,
Yeah, it is interesting. I think you nailed it. Like the thing with that medium-sized artist is that like they most often have not experienced like the big studio experience, and they've never really worked with the right team or had the right budgets, or like you said, the experience of making records is very different when you're a small artist versus someone who's very successful and has all the bells and whistles and budgets and stuff to make your record come to life. And so I think that it's often people trying to like put a square peg in a round hole kind of thing, where it's like they're trying to squeeze as much as they can out of their limited resources, or like you said, like making home recordings that maybe are kind of poor quality, and then they're like, how come it doesn't sound like the big studio? And it's like, well, you don't know what you're doing. You didn't have the right person engineering it or something like that, So I could totally see that logic behind why those smaller artists end up giving you more trouble, and I think it's a matter of like, yeah, if you're gonna hire an engineer or a producer, like lean into that, find the right people on your team, and then you're gonna get the right results with it, right? So I think that makes a big difference there. You talked about working with other producers and like some of the bigger projects and having your own role in a project. And one project that I know you recently worked on that I was curious to dive into is you worked with Mötley Crüe and Bob Rock, which, I mean, that's an amazing combination right there. So
yep.
How did that come about?
They were in London because they were touring, and they had to finish some stuff for the record, the songs, the EP that was released. They had to finish some stuff on that. And because of management, they booked the studio, and I was the right person for the job. So, right time, right place. It's basically that, and it was great. It was amazing. Not a lot of preparation. They sent me a tracks the day before of the things we needed to cut some vocals. Bob called me half an hour before the session because he was in Hawaii. So he was producing from Hawaii. We were streaming the session. We had a computer with a Zoom in the live room where Vince was gonna do the vocals. I had my phone here with the screen, but we were streaming the session through audio movers. So it had a high fidelity or high quality audio. He called me half an hour before just to talk about music and talk about to know me, because we were going to work together. So it was one of the most humble people that I've worked with. Probably one of the most, for sure. And getting, having the time to talk to me. And I had a David Bowie shirt that day, and said like, oh, David Bowie, I love David Bowie. And we start like getting along because of that, and it was great. And then I went out for a cigarette, and I was with the booking manager of the studio outside having a cigarette before the session. And suddenly I see a huge bodyguard and then big hair, and I was like, oh fuck, this is Mötley Crüe. It was Nikki and Vince coming in, so it was great. They were super nice with me in the studio. It was very, very easy. We nailed 2 songs in 3 hours. So it was pretty cool.
That's crazy. I mean, that's definitely got to be nerve-wracking to some degree when you're working with a producer like Bob Rock, like remotely, like they're not even in the room with you. So like it's putting a lot of trust in your engineering skills, which obviously like you wouldn't have got the job if you weren't fit for the job anyway. But that's very cool. Like, what would you say were like some of the lessons that you learned from working with Bob and kind of going through that experience with the band? Well,
Bob was quiet for most of the session unless I asked him something related to production. He was very like patient and listening to everything. So it was pretty good in that regard. Or he rests a lot on me. He'll give me a lot of freedom to work in the session. But seeing the session arrangement and the music arrangement and how everything was done, and some things were so simple, some things like tempo changes and stuff like that was like amazing. It was just a couple of BPMs here and there just to enhance one section. When you go like, that slows down a little bit, and then the chorus spits up a little bit. So the things like that were incredible. were so good. And his approach with the vocals, like what he was listening to, and it was like, yeah, we got it. We had 5 takes of each section, and that's it. Nothing eccentric. We didn't do 80 takes. Vince performed amazingly. It was pretty good, and so yeah, it was great. I think his approach is a very musical approach. He's always focusing on vibe and how things sound. If it's a good take, it's great, and that's it. It's not overdoing it, so it's cool. And as far as I know, the bass of the track, like the bass tracks, drums, guitars, and bass, were recorded together live. So they were playing amazingly. Everything sounded incredible. So the few things we did here, it was very, very easy.
That's very cool. Well, obviously, I guess, when you're working with great players and people who have that experience of, decades of making music, you're going to get good performances, and they know what they're doing. They're not just figuring it out on the fly. They're pros. So yeah, that definitely helps.
I was actually in the same room. I was sitting here, and I had Nikki just next to me. It was really fun. It was like one of those dreams you have as a kid. You're like, one day I want to work with Mötley Crüe, but it's probably impossible. I had a few of those in my life, but it's like, it's not gonna happen.
Nice. Did you read the dirt before they came in and get all pumped up?
Yeah. No, they're like super clean now and super vibe. They're dads and stuff, so they're like super nice people. They're really, really nice. The only thing, Nikki brought out a bottle of water and put it on top of the board, and I look at him from like the rear of the eye like that, and he said, "Not my first rodeo, cowboy." And I was like, fine, you can pay for another console.
Yeah, you can pay for that. Yeah, yeah. I think someone in that position, they know what they're getting into, and they'll take that chance.
Yeah. He was directing a lot of the production on the takes. Like when we were doing like vocal takes, he was a lot of like helping the Vince and stuff. But he wasn't like he wasn't on top of Vince. Like, have to. No, it was very, very chill. It's like, hey, yeah, you're doing great. Let's do another like this or whatever, and just sitting next to me and stuff. So it was pretty chill. Super, super easygoing session. I think one of the easiest sessions I've had. Nerve-wracking at the beginning, but I think I have this thing that, like you're excited about a session and maybe you're like a bit nervous, but the moment that I enter to the studios, like that disappears. This is my house, This is where I do records. I know this room better than anyone else in the room, probably, when I'm working with the people that don't use this room often and stuff. And it's like, I'm here for a reason, and that's it. And usually it's super nice, so.
That's awesome. I love that. It's good to hear stories like that, especially with a band like that who has such a crazy history behind it, and you hear all the wild stories and stuff. So you never know what you're getting into, I guess. But yeah, that's awesome. Cool. Well, I'd love to dive in a little bit to your mixing process, and we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, just like the sound of your records and how they tend to have a lot of cool character and everything to them. What's your mindset going into a mix? Like, how do you start? Where do you start? What kind of things are you thinking about before you even start adding any processing to a mix?
Well, I listen to the rough a little bit, but I don't care too much about rough mixes.
Just like your references.
It's like, yeah, it depends how developed it is, Sometimes you do 10% to a mix. Sometimes you do more. But I listen to it a couple times to learn the song while I'm prepping the session, or like depends if I'm prepping the session or I have an assistant prepping the session. But in that process, I listen to the tracks and figure out what's what, and have everything to understand the arrangement, especially, and what's happening. Sometimes I use the reference to like the rough mix to understand what are they looking in a part or in a section of the song. But mostly I try to go by instinct. I feel that instinct is the way that I've always worked, and how I feel is like a gut thing, You have your gut instinct that tells you like, you should try this, you should go this way or whatever. So I try to go by instinct completely. And yeah, I'll approach it that way. I will have all my tracks ready. I spend lots of time prepping, editing if I have to, or arranging everything into my template and have everything arranged the right way. I use almost always the same things for everything. I like, I'm systematic about how I do something. There's room for experimentation Obviously, there's always room for experimentation, but I like to use a specific type of compressors for the specific things, or EQs, or saturation, or clippers, or whatever thing that I'm using. I have something that I've been using for a good time. Usually it takes me like 6 months to figure out something that is not great in my template, or something that is not great with what I'm doing, or something that I can improve in what I use. Even if I do different genres of music, if you've seen the stuff that I've mixed, it's quite varied in genres. So even if it's a different genre, I approach it always the same way. Like I try to be consistent with what I do, and that gives me consistent results, I think. So I start like that, prepping, having everything ready. Then I start pushing all the faders up and try to figure out where is everything. And I do a rough mix with all my mix post processing on already. So I do top down mixing. I work from the mix post down. So I will start there, pushing all the faders up, figure out the balance, panning, and all that type of stuff, and then I will tackle individual tracks and start going with or bosses and individual tracks or parallels and stuff like that. But I work that way. I try to do a lot of work without soloing. I will solo if I have to correct something, or I have to go to something more specific, or if I'm not hearing something that I need to hear and figure it out. But I try to work as little as possible without soloing and stuff. Maybe I will work only on the drums for a while. Only working on drums and bass, drums, bass and guitars, or drum, bass and vocals, and work a little bit like that for a while. But I try to mix most of the time with all the faders up and stuff.
Yeah. As far as taking that top-down approach instead of the bottom-up, I guess, what inspired you to kind of work that way instead?
I think working on SSL consoles, and it's like a kind of old-school way of working. There's a lot of mixers that work that way, other mixers that work that way, like classic big names. They always have the stuff on. Or maybe you can do a rough and switch it on, and then you start processing everything. But I try not to, I don't go and add this X amount of top end or X amount of low end. I have what I use, how I use it, and I just tackle that in the way that I know it works. You have a very small good place, that you have a nice place where it sounds good. If it's low, if it's not there, it's not gonna sound good, and if it's louder than that, it's not gonna sound great. So you have a window of good sound in the approach. I think it's like I think Michael Brower worked in a way like that. Saying that it kind of works if you hit the things the right way. If you don't, it's
So what would you typically include on your master bus? Because some people hear master bus first, and then they go crazy with like EQ and all sorts of stuff, and they really over manipulate it. So I'm curious to know just like what's on your master bus and how do you start that?
I have a couple things on master bus. I usually start with an SSL bus compressor. I have a version from like a clone from Stam Audio that has the high pass. That one sounds really good.
I have the same one right in front of me. They're awesome.
Yeah, I think that one has the red cans, like the original DBX type of, like they copied the original DBX compressor, so it sounds better, like the mid-90s SSLs. Has a little bit more character or more saturation to it. So I love that compressor. I think it sounds amazing. So I start with that. This is one of the things that I think people are going to say, like, you're nuts. But I go 10-to-1 ratio. Slow attack, fast
which is
release.
Pretty extreme for a lot of people for the master bus.
Yeah, but it's barely moving, so if it gets to 2 dBs of compression, it's a lot. So it's barely moving, it's just catching stuff there. Then I will go to my SSL Fusion, where I boost top end, low end, a little bit of drive, a little bit of widening, maybe. The only thing that I will change during the course of a song, it might be the high frequency compressor. Maybe if the top end is a little bit like pushing a little bit too much, I will tame it with that compressor. And then from there I go to loop shorter, saturate. Yeah, saturation in parallel. It's not a clipper, but it just makes the track sound fatter and bigger with saturation. And then depending on the studio that I'm working and the project, I might go to tape and print the mix to tape. or I may go just back to tools and have like a tape emulator or something like that. And at the end of that chain, I will have a clipper. I think the gold clip. You had Ryan on your podcast, right?
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
Yeah, I met him. I think it was 2 years ago. He was here showing the plugin before it was released or something like that. And I was amazed by that plugin. I think it sounds amazing. It's meant to be like the Lavery, the clipping section of the Lavery Gold. So I love that sound. I think it gives a little bit of like an oomph at the end of to the track. So yeah, that's what I use usually. It's a few processes, but
yeah, you're doing quite a bit to it. But it also sounds like even though you have a lot on the chain, you're not really hitting everything super hard, especially like with your compressor. You know, if you got an extreme ratio like that, then you have to be very careful with it. Otherwise, you can totally kill your mix and all the dynamics in it, right?
Well, you will say it's extreme, but because of the ratio is quite high. But it's the way it reacts that I find it sometimes even more transparent than when you work with a 221 or 421. That you kind of wanna get the needle moving a little bit more. But I can hear more the compression when I do 221 or 421 because you tend to compress more.
You tend to push into it. Yeah, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, you know, with anything like that, a compressor where it's time-based, yeah, if you push into it, you're going to feel that pump or whatever it is, right? So, yeah, if you're going with a high ratio, but you're barely hitting it, then you're just getting more of, it's almost acting like a limiter or a clipper to some degree there, right?
Yeah, in a way, you can get the pump, but it's not. It doesn't feel the same. It has a different feel. I can express it in a different way because to me, you know, everything is about like the vibe and the feel of it. Of course, I can go technical about it and how it's reacting to the peaks and stuff like that. But I feel that it sounds more transparent in a way and just creates the right type of pump that I want and not overly doing it. Then I have the VCAs. You know, I have VCAs in tools, or if I'm mixing on a board, I have the VCAs on the board, and with that I can automate how much I'm hitting depending on the section. So I tend to go in verses a little bit less heavy-handed on compression, and maybe on the chorus I will go a little bit more heavy-handed, so about 2 dBs or something like that. Depending, like it could be more if it feels good, but usually it's not more than 2 dBs, so it's 2 dBs. So sometimes the verses, the needle is barely moving, and then you get to the chorus and it just pumps a little bit more, and you get the extra oomph in that section. So, but I use a lot of the VCA automation from section to section to create those moments. Because nowadays, like everything is so compressed and so big and stuff that you need to play with those automations to create. Even in the 80s, they were still doing it, automating on the SSL and the VCA, and the 90s as well, like automating writing from one section to the other. So
yeah, of course. Yeah, I think that there's something to be said for like the fact that everything does tend to get really compressed these days. Like it kind of works to your advantage to some degree because you can make a static mix that feels really good and locked in, but then you can create all the dynamic control that you need naturally in the mix, as opposed to just like leaving it to be a free for all. Then you don't know what's going to pop in and out throughout the track. So yeah, there's something to be said for that. Like compressing everything quite heavily, I guess, or like throughout the whole track, and then playing with the automations. That's definitely cool. You talked about having the saturator on your master bus, and we talked about how you like to use saturation in general. What's your typical approach with adding saturation? Like, how do you know what to use or how far to go with it, that kind of thing?
Well, I think it's track to track basis. No, some tracks I can go very heavy handed. If it's something like more lo-fi or more aggressive, I can go like push a lot of stuff a lot, maybe in parallel, so you get the clear sound but also the saturation to make it pump a little bit or get like push forward. But I think it's song to song basis. It depends on the track. I will go differently. I have saturation in different sections. Like I have on the master bus, but I have also on the drums. Like on the drums, I have a few parallels. I used to tend to have like 2 or 3 parallels that I can automate in different sections, and it can change. So it could be plugins or hardware depending on where I'm mixing. But it could be a couple of distressors in parallel. It could be maybe a loop trotter as well, or a black box, or maybe a culture vulture, things like that, depending on what it is, or maybe a devil lock. That's pretty cool. And play with those things. And maybe one section you push a little bit more on one of the parallels, and it just gets bigger and sounds nicer. I tend to do that with drums a lot, with bass maybe. Sometimes I add a little bit more saturation. I usually reamp a lot of stuff when I'm mixing. So I will reamp guitars, I will reamp the bass, even synths, pass it through pedals. And like, you know, if it's a soft synth, sometimes it lacks depth, and maybe just passing it through guitar pedals or through an amp just gives you a little bit of air, and that helps it sit better in the mix. Or even pass it. Sometimes I've passed things through. I have a ARP 2600, and I will pass it through the filter of the ARP 2600 and play with that and add color through it and things like that. So
that seems to be the secret weapon of choice. Like, I've had quite a few people on the podcast who talk about, I have access to the ARP. It seems like it's a very cool piece of equipment to really like manipulate sounds and get some cool character out of it.
Oh, you can do so much with it. You can do so many things. You can filter, you can use it, you can plug a guitar straight in and just get really cool distortion sounds and filter it and add ring modulation or whatever and just make it really weird, or pan it or create effects that it will be difficult sometimes to make in other ways. And also has a spring reverb on it, so you can add a little bit of spring if you want. So yeah, it's a cool trick. It's a cool thing to have and use it.
Very cool. I know that there's a plugin version of that, but I don't know if it allows you to run it through the line inputs or the input preamp or whatever.
I have no idea, but any analog synth that you can pass things through, it's going to give you a good fun. You know, modulating stuff and filtering it or saturation. So it's pretty cool.
That's very cool. So, I mean, obviously, yeah, it's going to be a case-by-case basis, but like when you're adding saturation to, let's just say drums, for example, you know, what kind of things are you looking to add with saturation? Because some people listening to this might be newer in their journey of audio engineering, and they hear saturation and they immediately think of like heavily distorted guitars or something like that, you know? But saturation isn't always super obvious with that kind of stuff. So what kind of stuff are you listening for when it comes to adding that saturation?
Texture and punch, probably. So there are two things that you can get. Like, you know, even if you use a clipper, and a lot of people are using clippers nowadays on everything, and I can sin of using clippers on drums. It just helps to sit things in the track better, you know, just rounding things up, but getting things louder by just rounding the top, you know, the peaks of things, but still having the punch and still having the quality of it, but just moving it forward. And I like really forward things. If you listen to some of the tracks that I've mixed, like everything's like I like the vocals to be very close and the drums to be like very punchy and always be hitting there, but very colorful. So I always try to look for texture and punch mostly. Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah, and I think that's something that like it takes practice to learn when it comes to saturation. It's like it's learning the tools and learning how extreme things can go, and I think you just kind of have to sit with it and experiment with it on different instruments to kind of find like where certain tools work really well, and you know how far you can go to get something cool out of it.
I've overdone it for sure. I think if you don't overdo it, you're not gonna learn how much you can do to something. But I think with time is that thing. You know, when you start, that everybody tells us like, oh, you don't hear compression. It's like, no, you don't hear compression. Your ear is not developed enough to understand compression. Same with saturation. Like, you're not developed to hear saturation. And sometimes you can be very subtle and add, like, let's say you have a decapitator and put like the saturation in, I don't know, 1, 2, or 3, and it's very subtle, but it's changing like the character of a sound completely, or not completely, but changing the character of the sound without being aggressive. And maybe it's just a simple thing as that, and filtering that just creates the right space for something. So it could be something as simple as that, just adding a little bit of that, or it can be very aggressive and put Isotopes trash on something and just obliterate the sound of something. Like, for instance, the Deadlock, which is a compressor, it's like a limiter, but it has also saturation on it. I like to use it sometimes on percussion. Like, I don't know, it's like some percussive drums or like percussion, like small drums or like a tambourine, even a hi-hat, and having like super compressed and with a bit of saturation, it just change completely the character of a sound and just makes it different. Like, I don't like the things to sound just as they sound. Like if it's, I want things to be larger than life, unless I'm looking for something that is very true to the original sound. But I tend to record things in a way that sound like larger than life.
Yeah, I love that. You're absolutely right. Like even the smallest bit of saturation it just reshapes the sound a little bit. And sometimes that makes it warmer. Sometimes that makes it smoother sounding. Sometimes it can make things more aggressive, but you do have to kind of play with it. And it's funny you mentioned like putting saturation on hi-hat. Like that's something I find myself doing all the time, because I find like so many people have like these really thin sounding hi-hats, or they hit them really gently. And like, if you just throw a saturator on there, you can make it sound like they're hitting it hard and like really like rocking out to it. And it just transforms your drum sound altogether. So it's kind of just finding these unique ways of placing saturators just to get some extra character and feel to the track. So yeah, I think there's a lot that you can do with that. How do you ultimately know in the end with a mix, like when you're done with it? That seems to be the thing that a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, that's a tough one. But my mentor in Argentina, Tweety, he always said that you don't finish a mix, you abandon it. So because it gets to a moment that you start overthinking and it's just a complete downward spiral, and you had something that sounded great and you destroy the mix if you stay 5 minutes longer. So I think it's you have to figure out. I don't think I'm ever happy with the mixes that I do. Like I'm not I know that I finished the mix, but I'm not like, oh yeah, it sounds amazing. I tend to hate everything that I worked on, and it's like, just because I tend to hear only the mistakes and only like, the stitches of things. So I can hear all the things that you're not supposed to hear. That's what I'm hearing, and I hate it. So I try to mentalize and work. I work pretty quickly when I do a mix. I spend more time prepping and all that than actually mixing. I tend to mix in like 3-4 hours. And if it's something really long or difficult, I might spend more time. That's not including revisions. Obviously, revisions is a different thing. It's like if you want to change something and all that. But yeah, that's the way I approach things. Try to do as quickly as I can. Have a couple breaks. I tend to go out, have a little bit of a break, come back in, keep listening. But yeah, in 4 hours you should have something that sounds good enough. If you're spending 10 hours or 15 hours on a mix, you're probably doing something wrong, or the product, the original material was so bad that you have to do miracles to make it work somehow. So
yeah, you start to lose your objectivity after time. So I 100% agree with you. Like, you have to work fast. And the other tip that I'll give to people listening to this is like, work fast, but then as soon as you start to feel like you're excited by your mix, print it. Like, if you want to do extra work, save it as an extra session, and like always give yourself that moment of excitement and to go back to. I even found myself doing that last night with the mix. Like, I was working on something and I was like, yeah, this is great. And then I started listening to like other things and getting too in the weeds. And like an hour later, I was like, oh shit, I went too far with this. Now it sucks compared to what, like an hour ago. So luckily I had a backup, went back an hour, and it was good, But we sometimes need to just like save our progress whenever you feel like you're excited, save it and really lean into that excitement. I think that's probably a good way to go about doing it.
Yeah, I usually will storm out of a studio and have my cigarette break and be like, sucks, it's horrendous or whatever. And then I come back, it's like, oh yeah, it's not that bad or whatever. But like you need to have a bit of a break too, because you get used to. That's a problem. That's why I think we have to mix quickly, because if you get your ear gets used to everything so quickly, so quickly that something that you might hear with fresh ears, you don't hear it because you're used to hearing it for 3 hours. So it's very important to do it that way, do it very, very quickly and to mix at low volume always. If you get excited with something mixing at low volume, it's probably exciting. But it's so easy to like blast it and it's like, oh yeah, sounds super good. And I've seen of that. Like I've done that when I was in my early 20s. I was like mixing super loud. It's like, oh yeah. And when I was working in the States, people were always blasting everything. It's like, oh yeah, so good. And then you listen to it, it's like, there's no dynamics on anything. Everything sounds like and stuff. So I prefer to work very, very quietly. Sometimes crank it and see how it, or hear how it feels. in a louder volume, maybe you can get, it's a little bit more aggressive on certain frequencies and stuff. But most of the time I mix pretty quietly to understand the dynamic of a song and understand the sound of it and how it's reacting and the automations and stuff. If you can hear the kick drum at low volume or on your phone, like you can play it on your phone, and if you can hear it on your phone, it's like, well, it's probably there, right?
Yeah. That's a great tip, because I do think a lot of people just monitor loud because it does sound exciting, but then at that point you're feeling air, and it's a different experience, and most people aren't going to be listening on studio monitors cranked in a nice room that has treatment, all that kind of stuff. People are going to be listening to it at low volumes on their phone, so your mix has to still sound good for the majority of people who are listening that way.
I always say that you have to be able to hear the kick drum. The snare, you're always going to hear it unless you're doing something wrong. But the kick drum, you're going to hear it. The bass drum, you have to hear it. The bass drum and the kick drum and the bass track or synth bass or whatever, you have to be able to hear it. So that's when saturation might come in handy, to be able to hear the bass cutting through a mix in a small speaker. Because maybe it's very sobby and it gets lost in a phone if you're playing it from the phone. But if you have a little bit of saturation on the higher octave or something like that, it might cut through and you might hear the note. And I think it's important. So always check on those.
Yeah, that's a great tip. And I the bass distortion thing is something I find myself doing all the time. And it just makes your life a lot easier to hear on smaller speakers or some of those frequency limited things, right? So yeah, great tip there.
A rat pedal in parallel.
Yeah. For me, I love that B7K plugin, like the Dark Glass. That thing's amazing. Like it's so insanely distorted sometimes, but like you just run that in parallel and it's amazing.
Yeah, I tend to go like with Rat or Sandsamp or something like that. Or I have, as I said, I reamp things. So I have a few pedals there. I have like a color box from JHS pedals, and I tend to have like the normal reamp that I do and a saturated one that I play with it. Maybe in the chorus you push that one a little bit further and just pops in the chorus, and you're like, oh yeah, the bass is rocking now, and you can feel it more and stuff like that. So yeah,
that's awesome. So at the end of the day, like in your mind, what ultimately makes a great sounding mix?
What makes a great sounding mix? Emotion. A great sounding mix is emotion. Like our jobs is to enhance emotions, right? It's not to do trickery and wizard stuff and trying to make something incredible. No, it's about enhancing the emotion. So how can I make this to make me feel something? To enhance that emotion that's already on the track. If the track has any emotion, it could be a cold track and and you're gonna have a harder time. But even if it's a track that's maybe lacking a bit of emotion, how can I make this? How can I turn this into something that makes me emotional or excites me? And not in volume, but excites me. Like, oh yeah, this is happening. So that's I think that's a good mix. A good mix is a mix that moves you. That if it's a slow track, something that just transmits a lot of emotion and it's in the right place, or if it's a loud track, that it punches and it's like, yeah, it gets you pumped in and excited. So it's about the emotion, I think.
That's awesome. I agree with that as well. Man, this has been really fun. I've really enjoyed learning more about your process and just learning how you approach your plugins and tool selection and all that kind of stuff. So this has been great. Thank you very much for this. If people want to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Instagram, I have an Instagram account, is MAS, so Mas Carlos, so MAS Carlos. And I have a website that is www.carlos-mas.com. And I think those are the two places that you can find my work and my stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, lots of great examples on your website, too, of all the productions you've worked on. So, yeah, definitely cool to check that out. Again, Carlos, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been really fun. Really, really fun.
So that was my episode with Carlos Mas, and I really enjoyed that. I think that hearing his whole journey in music production is quite amazing. The fact that he's had to start over so many times and move to so many different places and, have that path of starting as a runner, working for years, trying to become an engineer, ultimately getting it, and then starting over. I think that is a really powerful story. And it really goes to show the level of determination that he had. And for a lot of people, I think that would be a very frustrating process to go through. And I'm sure it was for him as well. But, it serves as a good reminder that like sometimes if you have a goal, you have to just try things out. You have to be willing to sacrifice. You have to be willing to take chances. And if that means that you have to go back a step in order to advance 2 more steps, then that's what you have to do, right? And ultimately, in his case, it has led to a great career where he's getting to work on some awesome projects in an awesome studio. And, his career is finally at a point where I think he wants it to be, And so I say that because if you are going to take that traditional studio route of trying to get internships and all that kind of stuff, it can be a very slow process, as Carlos indicated here. And, the reality is that is just the way studios work these days. There's fewer big studios out there and a lot of competition trying to get those spots. And so it's unfortunate, but that's just kind of the way it is. And, the other side of it too is unfortunately there's a lot of studio owners that take advantage of interns and, there's never an intention to hire people. And that's just that's maybe a whole other rant. But, I say that because, if you do want to be in a traditional studio, you're going to have to deal with some crap here. And ultimately, if you push through it, you can end up on the other side where you finally end up in a good spot. But yeah, you just have to be mindful of who's taking advantage of you and just keep, again, focused on the end goal, right? Now, for some people, the traditional studio route isn't the way you want to go. For some people, just being able to record your own music is all you need, right? Or starting your own home studio. I think there's a lot of opportunity out there for people to have profitable careers in a home studio because you don't have to work for anyone else who's going to determine your wages. You can get away with having fewer pieces of gear or less expensive pieces of gear. You don't need a big SSL console in your basement, but you can still get good results and you can still work with local artists and make a healthy career off of it. I mean, certainly that's worked for me and for countless engineers that we've had on this podcast and other people that I know. So, sometimes with these episodes, the reason why I like to showcase so many different people in different areas of the industry is to show you what's possible. And you can kind of pick your own adventure here and find what journey seems best to you. Now, ultimately, if you want to learn how to do this on your own and you don't want to take that traditional intern route or work at a big studio, and instead maybe you just want to work on your own music or record other people from your home studio, and you're looking for a fast way to learn this, then like Carlos talked about in this episode, having a mentor can be really helpful. And you can gain a lot of knowledge when you work with someone who can pass off their proven process to you, whether it's in a studio or whether it's something online, right? Now, if you are interested in getting one-on-one help to help you learn the entire process of recording, editing, and mixing your music, and understanding how to get pro results from your home studio, and ultimately how to make music that sounds pro and that can help you build a portfolio so that if you do want to attract clients for your studio, you can lead with your best foot forward and showcase your skills. If you want one-on-one help with that, then I would absolutely love to help you through that process. And inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, that's exactly what I do. I work one-on-one with students to help them go through the entire production process from beginning to end. And you end up with a repeatable system that gives you clarity in terms of what steps to take, what tools to be using, what to be listening for, and knowing how to get the sounds that you hear in your head to come out of your speakers. And throughout that process, I'm in your back pocket giving you feedback and guidance as you work through everything, just to make sure that you're on the right path and to give you that confidence that you're ultimately doing things right and getting the best results. So if you're interested in learning more about this, make sure to check out masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details of the program there. And then on that page, there's a link where you can apply for the program and book a call with me, where I'd love to learn more about your goals and what you're working on and your processes to see how I can help and if I can identify any gaps in your process that we could focus on. And if you're a good fit for the program, then we'll talk all about the program and how you can join. And I'd love to work with you to help get your skills to that point where you're confident and excited about the results you're making, and that ultimately you end up with music that sounds every bit as good as what you've heard in your head. So again, if you're interested in learning more, make sure to check out masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can get all the details there. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.